For 70 years, we've been told that Princess Margaret's heart was broken by the crown. Check the dates, and a colder story appears. She was handed a choice. She chose the palace. The version most people know goes like this. A princess fell in love with a war hero, the crown stepped in, the church weighed in, and the machinery of state crushed them both. She wept. He was packed off to Brussels. And on the last day of October 1955, her statement went out over BBC radio. Dutiful, heartbroken, finished. A royal tragedy, confirmed by the Crown, endorsed by decades of documentaries, absorbed by a generation as received history. Now, put the documentary away and look at the calendar. What the calendar shows isn't a helpless woman destroyed by forces she couldn't resist. It shows a deliberating one. 32 months of deliberation, to be exact, from the moment senior royals first knew of the romance to the moment Margaret ended it publicly. During those 32 months, she wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, met the Archbishop of Canterbury twice in October alone, and told the world, in a statement she personally approved word for word, that she had reached this decision entirely alone. This is an argument, not a revelation. The people who have known Margaret's story well enough to be honest about it have been making this argument in varying registers for decades. What makes it cuttable isn't psychology or gossip. It's the sequence of specific, verifiable dates that place the deliberation in order and show, event by event, what the decision looked like from the inside. The statement she issued on October 31, 1955, is a public document. Read it against the tragedy version, and the tragedy version dissolves sentence by sentence. Not a cry of grief, an acceptance letter. December 10, 1936. At Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, a man sat down and ended a reign that had lasted less than a year. King Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication in a high-ceilinged room in his private retreat, a house he had spent years renovating, a place he had made comfortable and personal precisely because the other palaces had never felt like his. His three brothers, Albert, Henry, and George, stood as witnesses. When he broadcast to the Empire the following evening, his voice came through radios across Britain and the Dominions with that distinctive quality of a man who had rehearsed composure. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. The woman was Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose second husband was still living. The Church of England wouldn't accept her as queen. The Dominion governments wouldn't accept her. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had told Edward directly and without warmth that the government couldn't support the marriage under any arrangement that allowed him to remain on the throne. The choice was the woman or the crown. He took the woman. His brother Albert, who had stammered through public duties his entire adult life and had never sought the job, became King George VI the following morning. He wasn't ready. He had not been raised for it. His elder daughter Elizabeth, 10 years old, had been playing quietly in a corner of the family's world, in the certain knowledge that the crown was her uncle's business and would remain so. Overnight, that certainty reversed. She was now heir presumptive. Princess Margaret was 6 years old. She had been born in August of 1930, and in December of 1936, she was still small enough that the events of that week would have reached her partly through the anxiety of adults and partly through the disruption of routine. The family moving from their house at 145 Piccadilly into Buckingham Palace, the altered schedules, the unfamiliar weight of ceremony pressing on everyone around her. She and her sister asked each other what had happened. One account records the exchange directly. Watching a newsreel or discussing what they'd been told, Margaret asked what abdication meant. Lilibet replied, "He abdicated. Why?" The sisters were working out together what their uncle had done. Buckingham Palace wasn't a house. It was an institution with staterooms and footmen and an invisible apparatus of protocol that determined who stood where and when anyone could speak to the family. The Yorks had lived in a townhouse. Now they lived in a place where you could walk for 10 minutes inside the walls without reaching an exterior window. Margaret's room overlooked the mall. What a 6-year-old absorbs from a constitutional crisis isn't constitutional analysis. What she would absorb over the following years, growing up inside the immediate aftermath of that event, watching her father struggle with a role that shortened his life, watching her mother manage a public face that required extraordinary effort, was the basic architecture of the problem. A royal who chooses a divorced person over the throne pays the price. Her father had not wanted to be king. Her mother had not wanted to be queen. George VI reigned for 16 years and died at 56. The family paid for Edward's choice and responsibility, in displaced lives, in the permanent repositioning of everyone in the room. There is a reading of the abdication that people in the family would have known, even if they couldn't say it aloud. That a man who had always found kingship unendurable had found in Wallace Simpson a convenient reason to do what he had long intended. A man who wanted out and used love as his exit route. Whether that reading is accurate belongs to another discussion and other evidence. What matters for 1955 is simply that Margaret grew up with both versions available: the official tragedy of the king who gave up everything for love, and the colder reading underneath it, that the king had been looking for a door, and Wallace was the one he'd chosen. She had been paying attention since she was 6. By the time she found herself navigating her own crisis with a divorced man in 1955, she understood the terrain. She had 19 years of evidence about what it cost to choose wrong in this specific way. Every adult in that palace had lived it. Her father's premature death had lived it. The whole shape of her own life, second in line, inhabiting the palace, drawing the income, playing the role, existed because her uncle had made his choice. The abdication wasn't just family history. It was the soil everything around her had grown in. Group Captain Peter Wooldridge Townsend was born on November 22, 1914, in Rangoon, Burma. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1933, trained at Cranwell, and by the summer of 1940 was commanding No. 85 Squadron, flying Hurricanes through the high noon weeks of the Battle of Britain. His wartime record? 9 aircraft destroyed, 2 shared, 2 probables, 4 damaged. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar in 1940 and the Distinguished Service Order in 1941. On August 31, 1940, a Messerschmitt cannon shell hit his cockpit over Kent, passing through the glycol tank and exploding in the cockpit. The cockpit filled with glycol and blood. He bailed out. Surgeons removed his big toe. He returned to operational flying within 3 weeks, and when the base doctor told him he wouldn't be flying for some time, he replied that he had just been flying. No more was said. His wartime memoir, Duel of Eagles, describes the exact texture of what that summer felt like from inside a hurricane. The speed of the closing distance, the particular quality of concentration required to fire on something that was trying to fire on you, and the strange intimacy of knowing the man in the other cockpit wasn't your enemy by nature, only by the particular catastrophe of 1940. In 1944, he was appointed equerry to King George VI, a 3-month RAF secondment that became 9 years of royal service. He served the king personally as equerry, then as deputy master of the household from 1950. The Independent's obituary, written by the biographer Michael Delanoy, described the dynamic plainly. Warned to take no notice if the king shouted at him, Townsend instead immediately warmed to what he recognized as the king's essential humanity and simplicity. The attraction was mutual. George VI came to regard him as the son he never had. This was the man's actual standing inside the family, not a staff member, not quite family, but somewhere in the useful and trusted space between. He was 16 years older than Princess Margaret. She was born on August 21, 1930. He had been born in 1914. On the first day Townsend arrived at Buckingham Palace in 1944, Margaret was 13 and he was 29, already married, already a father. One of her sister's reported remarks from that day, "Bad luck, he's married," catches the observation of a teenager who noticed him immediately. Townsend, by his own later account, saw her at that point as a privileged child. A contemporary account describes him as quite sharp with her during the 1947 South Africa tour, still treating her primarily as the younger daughter of his employer. The mutual recognition that something had changed came slowly. Margaret later told friends she fell in love with him during that same South Africa tour, where they often went riding together. Craig Brown, researching his biography Ma'am Darling, found a National Trust curator's account that Townsend had requested the bedroom adjacent to hers during a trip to Belfast in October 1947. His marriage to Rosemary Paul had been deteriorating for years. In August 1951, she committed adultery with John de Laszlo, son of the painter Philip de Laszlo. Townsend filed for divorce in November 1952. The decree nisi was granted on December 20, 1952, on grounds of his wife's adultery. He was the innocent party. He had done nothing to end the marriage except discover that his wife had. That designation appeared to offer something. It didn't. The Church of England's doctrinal position in 1955 was firm and absolute. It wouldn't solemnize the marriage of a divorced person whose former spouse was still living, regardless of fault, regardless of innocence. The Church of England didn't change its policy on remarriage after divorce until 2002. What Margaret was navigating wasn't an eccentric panic response from a frightened establishment. It was firm doctrine that would hold for nearly another half-century, through every shift in public opinion and every royal scandal in between. What the Church couldn't do, what no one ever suggested it could do, was prevent a civil marriage. The Archbishop of Canterbury's authority extended to the sacrament, not to the registry office. The civil road was open throughout. His independent obituary was candid about who Townsend actually was. Far from behaving in a scandalous manner himself, Townsend displayed, throughout the drama, impeccable decorum. He wasn't an inappropriate suitor by character or class. He was a war hero of genuine distinction, a man the king had loved. His impediment was a divorce certificate dated December 20, 1952, acquired through no wrongdoing of his own. By February 1953, the people immediately around Margaret already knew. Henry Chips Channon's diary records that Margaret had announced her intention of marrying Townsend months before the coronation. The entry is precise enough to place knowledge of the romance, and of her stated intent, firmly inside the palace before the public knew a word of it. Senior royals knew. The Queen Mother refused to speak to Margaret about it. The Queen herself was sympathetic by most accounts, but asked them to wait a year, hoping the situation would resolve. The romance had been visible inside the palace long before Fleet Street found it. In April 1953, Townsend proposed formally. Margaret informed the Queen directly of her intention to marry him. The public moment came on June 2, 1953, Coronation Day. Westminster Abbey was full to capacity and ringed with cameras. In the courtyard outside, among the officers and courtiers gathered in the processional space, Margaret was photographed brushing a small piece of lint from Townsend's uniform jacket. The gesture was brief and unguarded, the automatic intimacy of someone who knows a person's clothes as well as her own. Craig Brown, in Ma'am Darling, described what that meant to someone watching with a press photographer's eye in the 1950s. Interpersonal fluff-picking was a suggestive business. It wasn't physical affection by any modern standard. It was the visible sign of a private life that had no business being visible in public, and on Coronation Day, of all days, with the cameras everywhere. Fleet Street had the story within approximately 2 weeks. Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, the Queen's private secretary, had been watching. When Townsend came to him, needing presumably some guidance on how the situation should be handled, Lascelles gave him a verdict rather than guidance. Either you're mad or bad. That was Lascelles's full assessment of a group captain who had served George VI for 9 years and held the king's trust entirely. Mad or bad? No third option offered. Within a month, Lascelles had persuaded Winston Churchill to post Townsend to Brussels as heir attaché to the British Embassy. The arrangement was made, in one period description, quietly and quickly. The British ambassador in Brussels first heard about Townsend's appointment by reading a newspaper, not from the Foreign Office. On July 15, 1953, Townsend was informed of his start date. He left for Brussels. He served there from 1953 to 1956. 2 years of enforced separation. Letters exchanged, press speculation uncontrolled, Buckingham Palace's policy of no comment functioning in practice as confirmation for anyone paying attention. The exile was designed to kill the story by removing its male lead. What it actually did, without anyone intending this, was give Margaret an extraordinarily long and undisturbed period to calculate. She wasn't being forced to decide quickly. The machinery designed to suppress the romance was handing her time. She used it. August 21, 1955. Princess Margaret turned 25. The New York Times marked the date explicitly. Margaret, at 25, is free to marry, but sources close to British royal family say she does not aim to wed Townsend. The legal position had shifted in a specific way. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, descendants of George II under 25 needed the sovereign's direct consent to marry. After 25, a different mechanism applied. 12 months formal notice to the Privy Council, during which either House of Parliament could issue a disapproving address to block the marriage. But that disapproval wasn't automatic, and Parliament wasn't required to act. The outcome was no longer solely within the Queen's gift. On her birthday, Margaret worshipped at Crathy Kirk near Balmoral. Townsend was at Ostend in Belgium attending church. They were in different countries on the day the law governing her options had just changed in her direction. The press noted the separation. It was the kind of detail that filled column inches while everyone waited for the principal to do something. That same month, Margaret did something. She wrote directly to Prime Minister Anthony Eden from Balmoral. The letter, recovered from the National Archives by a television producer in 2004, is a document that Margaret's official biographer, Christopher Warwick, called a significant historical document, which put a completely different complexion on the accepted version of events. It deserves to be read carefully. Margaret told Eden she wouldn't be seeing Townsend during August or September, while she remained at Balmoral, but that he would return to London on leave in October, and that she intended to see him then. Then she wrote, "But it's only by seeing him in this way that I feel I can properly decide whether I can marry him or not." At late October or early November, she hoped to tell Eden and the other Commonwealth prime ministers what she intended to do. This isn't the letter of a woman who has already decided. This is the letter of a woman who is still in the process of deciding and wants the prime minister to understand her timeline. Warwick was direct about what it meant. Here was a very determined young woman in control of the situation, telling the prime minister that she hasn't yet decided. He added that the letter cast doubt on the assumption that the princess believed she would have to renounce all her royal privileges if she married Townsend, because, he noted, the new Prime Minister, Mr. Eden, had by that point ensured she would keep her HRH title and a civil list allowance, and the letter suggested she was aware the government was working toward an accommodation. The letter also carries one quiet detail at the end. "Only the Queen knows I am writing to you about this." Not the Queen Mother, not her private secretary, the Queen herself, informed of a personal letter between her sister and the Prime Minister about the most sensitive private matter in the family. The consultation was deliberate and considered. This was a woman who understood the channels of power and was using them precisely. The popular account of this crisis rests on a specific claim about the cost, that marrying Townsend meant giving up everything: her HRH title, her civil list income, her status as a working princess, her Kensington Palace apartment with its 35 rooms, the entire apparatus of the life she had been raised inside. The full forfeit, nothing retained. The National Archives released the relevant cabinet papers in January 2004. The actual documented plan looked nothing like the popular version. Prime Minister Eden had drawn up terms under which Margaret could marry Townsend while retaining her HRH title. She would retain her existing civil list allowance, then £6,000 per year. Eden explicitly recorded that exclusion from succession wouldn't entail any other change in Princess Margaret's position as a member of the royal family. The Guardian's January 2004 report stated it plainly. Princess Margaret was secretly given a categorical assurance by Downing Street that she could keep her HRH title and a civil list income if she married Peter Townsend. The BBC confirmed from the same files, the Queen and Eden drew up a plan in 1955 under which Princess Margaret could marry Townsend while keeping her royal title and her civil list allowance. The Civil List Act of 1952, actual primary legislation, is retrievable from Hansard. Its provision for Margaret specifies, in the event of her marriage, an additional £9,000 per year would be paid to her during her life, on top of the $6,000 already settled. Under Eden's plan, marrying Townsend would have made Margaret £15,000 per year, considerably more than she was then receiving. The financial argument against the marriage wasn't in the documented government plan. It existed in what Margaret apparently believed about the terms, which may have been considerably less generous than what Eden was actually offering. Alistair Lexton's analysis of the 1955 material is specific on this point. Margaret believed that losing her civil list income would have ruined her, and she wasn't informed of Eden's proposed additional £9,000 allowance. The gap between what the government was actually offering and what she understood to be on the table has never been fully explained. Lascelles, who had arranged the Brussels exile and described Townsend as mad or bad, had retired in 1953. His approach had been considerably less accommodating than Eden's. Whoever was translating the government's position for Margaret in October 1955 may have been working from an older, harsher understanding of the situation, one that predated Eden's more considered plan. The one concrete price in the documented plan was clear, and Margaret's own statement names it: renouncing her rights of succession and her children's rights of succession. She was third in line to the throne, behind Prince Charles and Princess Anne, two children who would anchor the line of succession for the next 7 decades. Renouncing a notional succession right 3 places removed from the throne was the actual documented cost. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. That sentence is in her statement. Not HRH, not income, succession rights. This adds a dimension to the argument rather than removing one. If Margaret chose the palace while believing she would lose her income, her title, and her public role, when the actual documented plan would have preserved all of those things, then she was making a rational calculation on information that appears to have been wrong. She was protecting security that was far more available to her than she knew. The trade she thought she was refusing was harsher than the trade actually on offer, and she still chose the palace. 32 months, February 1953 to October 31, 1955. That is the span from the moment Shannon's diary first records her stated intention to the public statement. 28 months from the coronation brush. Either way, this wasn't a sudden heartbreak. It was the longest, most considered, most extensively witnessed deliberation in mid-century royal history. The reconstruction of the final October is the part the tragedy version handles most selectively. October 1st. Anthony Eden, who had succeeded Churchill as Prime Minister in April 1955, flew to Balmoral. His purpose was specific: to present the terms of the government's position directly to the Queen and to Margaret. Ferdinand Mount's account in the London Review of Books places this meeting as the moment the formal offer was communicated. Eden came in person. This wasn't a letter or a memorandum passed through intermediaries. The Prime Minister flew to Scotland to put the terms on the table face to face. October 12th. Townsend returned to London and came to Clarence House. He and Margaret reunited there, their first meeting in months, the first real conversation they'd had since the summer. Anne de Courcy, in her account for Vanity Fair, described the reunion precisely. At Clarence House, October 12th, they faced each other again, and the question they'd been circling for 2.5 years was finally immediate. Townsend was 40. Margaret was 25. He had been in Brussels for 2 years before that. Whatever the reunion felt like emotionally, the room also contained the accumulated weight of everything that had been building since 1953. The exile, the press, the letters, the Prime Minister's visit to Balmoral 11 days earlier. Whatever Margaret felt when she saw him, she also knew she had already been to Balmoral with the terms in her hands. The reunion was both romantic and transactional. Two people who had genuinely loved each other, meeting to decide whether the terms of continuing were acceptable. October 13th through 19th, they spent time together. Accounts describe time at Uckfield House in Sussex, a borrowed country house, the last of whatever privacy they could manufacture in a story that had been public for 2 years. The description, "goodbye weekend," comes from Townsend's own memoir context. It was the kind of time couples spend when they are trying to remember what they had, or discovering whether they still have it, or both at once. October 19. Archbishop of Canterbury Geoffrey Fisher met Margaret at dinner. His counsel: don't proceed with the marriage. Fisher wasn't a soft presence. Now he sat across a dinner table from the woman at the center of it and told her what the church's position required. His influence over her was real. She had been confirmed in the Church of England in April 1946. She took her faith seriously, and the specific language of her eventual statement, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, shows Fisher's dinner made an impression. October 27, Margaret visited Fisher again at Lambeth Palace, his official residence south of the river, the formal seat of the Archbishop's authority. The New York Times confirmed the meeting. At this meeting, according to Ferdinand Mount's account, Margaret told Fisher she had already decided. This was 4 days before the public statement. The decision had been made privately at Lambeth Palace on October 27 and announced publicly at 7 in the evening on October 31st. Fisher would later claim there had been no pressure from church or state. Mount described this claim as a barefaced lie. The meetings had happened. The council had been unambiguous. The pressure was genuine and sustained. October 28th. Final meeting between Margaret and Townsend at Clarence House. October 31st. The statement. The full deliberation collapses into 19 days between Townsend's return and the broadcast. And within those 19 days, Margaret met Eden's terms at Balmoral already communicated, reunited with Townsend at Clarence House, spent a week together in Sussex, was counseled against the marriage by the Archbishop at dinner, visited the Archbishop again at Lambeth, told the Archbishop privately she had decided, met Townsend one final time, and then issued a public statement 4 days later. The machinery had been real. Fisher met her twice in October alone. Eden had flown to Scotland. Lascelles had spoken the mad or bad verdict 2 years earlier and arranged the Brussels exile. The institutional weight applied was genuine and substantial. But none of it constituted a legal prohibition. Parliament never voted. No civil marriage was attempted. No formal disapproving address was ever issued under the Royal Marriages Act, because the bill that would have triggered the parliamentary process was never introduced. It was never introduced because Margaret's announcement made it unnecessary. The machinery set the price. She decided not to pay it. Here, the argument arrives at its sharpest complication, and the dates require the most careful handling. The canonical tragedy reading depends on a specific emotional premise, that when Margaret renounced Townsend on October 31st, 1955, she was surrendering a present, mutual, fully alive romance. That what she gave up was completely there to be given up. Townsend's own memoir, Time and Chance, published in 1978, is explicit. Our feelings for each other were unchanged, but they had incurred for us a burden so great that we decided, together, to lay it down. He states the feelings were intact. He also says the decision was mutual. We decided, together. Taking him at his word, the love wasn't exhausted in October 1955, and both parties participated in closing it. What had changed was geography, and in Belgium, geography had produced something. During his 2 years in Brussels, Townsend attended a horse show sometime in 1953 or 1954. A young Belgian competitor, approximately 15 years old, the daughter of a wealthy cigarette manufacturer named Germania, fell from her horse and was briefly knocked unconscious. Townsend moved quickly from his seat to assist. A friend, identified in the Royal British Legion's Brussels branch account as Didi van Derten, reassured him and later introduced him formally to the Germania family. By early 1954, Townsend had become a regular visitor to the Germania estate in Brachet, near Antwerp. The Royal British Legion account, which draws on sources from within the Brussels British community who knew Townsend during his posting, is specific about what that house meant. Their house soon became a haven from the endless press speculation surrounding his relationship with Princess Margaret. During the years he was supposed to be waiting for the woman in London to decide, he had found somewhere in Belgium that felt like rest, a family, a young woman in their household whose name was Marie Luce. Craig Brown places Townsend's enamorment with Germania at approximately age 40, which dates the interest to 1953 or 1954. This is a biographer's reading of a trajectory, not a documented romantic attachment with a confirmed start date. No contemporary source records a romance between them before 1958. Townsend's memoir does not admit to one before Margaret's announcement. The publicly documented relationship begins in 1958, when Germania accompanied him on a 2-year world journey as his photographer and secretary. The engagement was officially announced on October 10, 1959. A Keystone Press photograph taken that day shows them together at the Germania family home near Antwerp, the same estate Townsend had been visiting since 1954. British Pathé issued its newsreel 5 days later under the title, "Townsend to Wed." Time magazine's coverage described him as the world's best-known rejected suitor, who had found a new bride-to-be 4 years after Britain's Princess Margaret sadly said no. They married in late 1959. 3 children followed. He settled in France. His independent obituary noted that he developed, too, a perceptible sense of relief that things turned out the way they did. 4 years after. That is Time magazine's phrasing. 4 years after Margaret's statement, not before it. The publicly documented romantic sequence runs from 1958 onward. What the record does not answer is what was developing in Brachet during 1954, during the years when the Germania family home was, by the account of his own community, Townsend's refuge from the Margaret story. He knew Marie Luce. He visited the family regularly. He found peace there that he wasn't finding in the London newspapers. Whatever the state of his feelings in October 1955, and he insists they were unchanged, the foundation for his next chapter had been laid in Belgium before that decision was announced. The family he would marry into was already sheltering him. The young woman he would eventually marry was already known to him. The record supports a trajectory. It does not support the specific claim that a romance had begun before October 1955, and the narrative here does not make that claim. What it establishes is something the tragedy version tends to elide. Townsend wasn't standing still in Brussels, waiting in suspended animation for Margaret's answer. He was building a life in Belgium. And the Belgian life he was building contained, from at least 1954, a family whose daughter he would marry 4 years later. One last documented detail from October 31, 1955. As the 7 o'clock BBC broadcast was being prepared, Townsend wasn't at Clarence's house. He wasn't in London at all. The frontispiece of his memoir carries a photograph with a caption, October 31, 1955. Peter Townsend leaves London immediately before Princess Margaret's renunciation was to be broadcast by the BBC. He had written the statement. He had shown it to her at their final meeting on October 28th, and she had said, in his account, That's exactly how I feel. He had drafted the announcement of his own rejection in language she described as exactly representing her feelings. And then, on the day it went out, he left London before it was broadcast. He didn't stay to hear it. Now read the statement itself. Not what the Daily Mirror put on its front page the next morning. Not what the New York Times called it in its November 1st headline. Princess decides, marriage barred by duty. The word barred was the newspaper's invention. It didn't come from Margaret's text. The headline is what the tragedy version was built from, the press's paraphrase of something that was already significantly different from what the statement actually said. Here is what Margaret actually said, broadcast at 7 in the evening on October 31st, 1955. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. The statement does not say she was prevented. It does not say she was forbidden or barred or instructed. It says she decided. Active voice, first person. The construction, I have decided, places every ounce of agency with the speaker. 2 years of institutional pressure, 2 audiences with the Archbishop, a Prime Minister flying to Scotland, and the first sentence of the public record says, I decided. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. She acknowledges the route existed. She had been aware, present continuous knowledge, not a late discovery presented to her in the final days. Throughout the entire crisis, a civil marriage had been available. She knew the price attached to it, the succession rights. She had been carrying that knowledge through 32 months of deliberation, and she names it here directly in the text. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. Resolved to put before. The language of hierarchy, of ranking one thing above another and committing to that ranking. She isn't describing an obstacle she couldn't overcome. She is describing a scale on which she has placed her values and found that her religious conviction and her public duty outweigh her personal desire. Whatever one thinks of those priorities, they are priorities, chosen, ordered, and declared. She made a ranking, and she is announcing how it came out. I have reached this decision entirely alone, and in doing so, I have been strengthened by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend. Entirely alone. This sentence is the one that should end the tragedy version's strongest claim, that the Crown crushed her, that the institutions decided for her, that she was a passive figure in her own renunciation. She claims full authorship, in writing, in public, as a permanent record. After the Archbishop of Canterbury met with her twice in October, after Eden flew to Balmoral, after a decade of family memory about what divorcees cost the Crown, after all of it, she wrote the words, entirely alone, and she told the man who drafted those words that they were exactly right. The word forbidden does not appear in this statement. Prevented isn't there. Barred isn't there. Those words live in newspaper headlines and documentary narrations, not in Margaret's own text. The document she approved and the document the tragedy version is built upon aren't the same document. There is one more piece of paper that belongs in this picture. The National Archives hold draft statements prepared by officials for the alternative outcome, the version where Margaret had said yes. One of those drafts begins, I have come to the conclusion that in all the circumstances, the best course for me to follow is to marry P.T. and give up my rights to the succession. Another prepared language about her future happiness. The paperwork existed for both outcomes. The road where she said yes was mapped, documented, and ready. She chose not to take it. Craig Brown, who spent years reconstructing the texture of Margaret's actual life for Ma'am Darling, arrived at a characterization that neither flatters nor condemns. Born in an age of deference, The princess was to die in an age of egalitarianism. Attempting to straddle the two, wanting to be treated as both equal and superior, and vacillating from one moment to the next between the easygoing and the hoity-toity, her behavior often led to tears before bedtime. What this captures isn't a woman who was stupid about her situation. It captures a woman who understood the life she was living with complete clarity and understood what it cost to maintain. She was at home inside the world of the Margaret set, the aristocratic social circuit, the Café de Paris, the Mirabelle, the late nights at the 400 Club, the balls, the residences, the assumption that any room she entered would reconfigure itself around her. Her apartment at Kensington Palace had 35 rooms. She required advance guest lists for dinner parties so she could veto anyone she found dull. Other guests were forbidden to start eating before her and required to stop when she stopped. Margaret ate very little, very quickly. If she felt people expected her to be grand, she tried to wrong-foot them. If they seemed inappropriately chummy, she closed like a clam. Her sense of protocol was fierce, precisely because she understood what it protected. A French guest at one of her dinners assessed her choice of evening wear with the verdict that it began too late and ended too soon. This was a woman who was provocative in drawing rooms. She was never actually provocative outside the palace. The two things existed in careful balance. Enough transgression to demonstrate she wasn't constrained, not enough to actually leave the structure that gave her the drawing rooms to transgress in. She could test the edges of the institution while remaining inside it. The income, the staff, the public duties, the celebrity, the houses. These weren't incidental benefits. They were the air she had been breathing since birth, drawn in every day for 25 years. Her father's private verdict on his daughters has been widely quoted. Elizabeth was his pride, Margaret was his joy. He indulged her beyond what he permitted her sister. She grew up knowing she was cherished in the specific way that royalty can be cherished, with money and staff and ceremony forming the material expression of that love. Leaving the life wouldn't have been like leaving a comfortable situation. It would have been like leaving the only version of herself she had ever been permitted to inhabit. She had also watched, from close range and for years, what it looked like when someone left. Her uncle had chosen the woman over the throne and then spent the rest of his life in a specific kind of gilded irrelevance. Received politely at occasional state functions when diplomacy required it, stripped of function, no longer the center of anything that actually mattered. The Duchess of Windsor was never received formally at court. The life outside the palace for a royal who had surrendered it wasn't ordinary life. It was a diminished version. All of the residual attention, stripped of the purpose that made the attention bearable. She had been watching this version of exile since she was 6 years old. She chose accordingly. The choice was consistent with the character Brown describes. A woman who could scandalize a drawing room without ever walking out the door. At 7 in the evening on October 31st, 1955, BBC Radio interrupted its scheduled programming to broadcast the statement from Clarence House. The Daily Mirror devoted its entire front page to the news the following morning. Of the 70,000 readers who wrote in over the following days, 67,907 said she should have been allowed to marry Townsend if she chose to. 2,235 said she shouldn't. 70,000 people responding to a newspaper poll about a royal romance. The public was grieving a love story. The public believed in the tragedy version. They had been watching it for 2.5 years. The calendar invites a different account. What Margaret renounced at 7 o'clock on October 31st, 1955, wasn't a man she was being forbidden to keep. It was the succession right that came attached to keeping him, and the acknowledgement that she valued what that succession right represented more than she valued the alternative. The civil marriage had been available throughout. Eden's documented plan would have allowed her to retain her title and her income. The actual price was third-in-line succession rights, behind 2 small children named Charles and Anne. She named that price herself, in a statement she approved as exactly right, drafted by the man she was renouncing. She chose not to pay it. The institutional machinery had been real and substantial. Fisher met with her twice in October alone. Eden flew to Balmoral in person. The pressure applied was genuine, and it came from every direction the institution could bring to bear: ecclesiastical, governmental, familial, legal. None of it was a flat prohibition. Parliament never voted. No civil marriage was attempted. The bill Eden had prepared for the alternative outcome was never introduced. It was never introduced because Margaret's announcement came first. The machinery set the price. She decided not to pay it. 4 years later, on October 10, 1959, Townsend announced his engagement to Marie-Luce Jaman, the daughter of the Belgian family in Brachet who had been his refuge since 1954. The Keystone Press photographs taken that day show them together outside her family's country house near Antwerp. They married in late 1959. He had 3 more children. He settled in France, where he wrote books and let his life there gradually heal all the wounds, in his Goodreads biographies phrase. He developed, in the words of his independent obituary, a perceptible sense of relief that things turned out the way they did. Margaret announced her engagement to the photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960. Biographers describe a woman who, in the years that followed, understood herself as the one who had sacrificed, that she had given something up for a man who had not remained faithful to the weight of that sacrifice. There's no doubt she felt betrayed by Townsend, one account puts it. What the Brachet timeline suggests is that the sacrifice wasn't as unilateral as she came to believe. He had not been standing still while she deliberated. The haven he found in Belgium during his exile was the same house where his next marriage would be announced. The tragedy was real. 2 people who had genuinely loved each other didn't end up together. The weight of the decision, and what followed from it, were the consequences of a real choice made by a real woman with clear knowledge of what she valued most. None of this is the same as saying she was wrong. The argument here isn't that the choice was a moral failure. It's that it was a choice, deliberate, informed, consistent with her character, and confirmed at every point by the documented sequence. The machinery of church and state set the price. It was a real price. She looked at it for 32 months, read the terms carefully, and decided the price was too high. The crown didn't take Peter Townsend from Princess Margaret. Margaret chose the crown over Peter Townsend. Her statement says she reached that decision entirely alone. 70 years of calendar entries have been quietly confirming it ever since. Subscribe for more stories like this.